In this tutorial, we will take a look at creating a lookup column for a list. With a lookup column, you can create a column in one list that provides a list of choices to select from that come from another list in the site. In this example, we will be working in the accounting site. Here I have a list named Approved Vendors. This is a list of all the vendors approved to do business with and their contact information. I am in the process of creating another list for tracking vendor expenses named Vendor Expense Tracking. This list consists of 3 columns: an invoice number, date of service, and amount. I still need to add a vendor name column, which I will pull from my approved vendors contact list through a lookup column. Rather than having to manually type in the vendor name each time, the lookup column will provide me with a list of all the vendors to select from. So to add this new column, I'll click on the List tab, and then I'll click on Create Column. And I'll name this column Vendor. And for the type of column, this is going to be a lookup column. In the Get Information From, I select the list where the vendor names will be coming from, which is the Approved Vendors list. In the next drop-down, I select which column the vendor names come from, which is Vendor Name. If I check the box Allow Multiple Values, it would let me select more than one vendor for each invoice, and that would not be applicable here, so I'll leave that unchecked. In this next section, I can select additional columns of information to display from the Approved Vendors list once I select a vendor name, and I'm going to just select the vendor ID to display. In the Relationships section, the Restrict Delete option would prevent me from deleting a vendor from the Approved Vendors list if that vendor was selected for any records in this Vendor Expense Tracking list. The Cascade Delete option would let me delete a vendor from the Approved Vendors list, but then it would also automatically delete any records in this Vendor Expense Tracking list for that vendor. If I leave this option unchecked, then I can delete vendors from the Approved Vendors list without affecting records already entered for that vendor in this expense tracking list. But for this demonstration, I'm going to select the option to Restrict Delete, and then I'll choose OK to save. And then I'll choose OK to index the column. So you'll see the new vendor column has been added over here to the right. And by the name, it indicates that it's showing me not only the vendor name, but also the vendor ID. So I'll add a record to my new list here. And then to select the vendor, you see it provides me with a drop-down, and here are all the vendor names from the Approved Vendors list. And I'll choose Glenwood Machines as my vendor, and then I'll click Save. So here's the vendor name and the vendor ID for that vendor. The vendor name is linked to the vendor information from the Approved Vendors contact list. So now I will demonstrate the relationship option I selected, which restricts deleting a vendor if they're already used in the expense tracking list. So I'll go back to my Approved Vendors list, and I'll delete the vendor I selected, which was Glenwood Machines. Click on Delete Items and choose OK to delete. So instead of deleting that vendor, I get this error message explaining why the vendor cannot be deleted from the list. And I just click OK to clear the error. So here you have an example of how lookup columns can save data entry time and maintain accuracy and consistency of data entered in a list.